Hello, it's the early hours of the 12th of February 2018. Yesterday there was a tragedy involving Russian aviation. Um, Big disaster. It's thought that 71 people have perished. Now, the airline involved was an Antonov-An 148 model, and the company involved was the Saratov Airlines Flight 703. This accident occurred in Moscow Oblast, um, outside Domodedovo Airport, which is one of Russia's two main airports. And as I understand it, the flight was, I don't know if it was going to or coming back from the city of Orsk in Orenburg Oblast, just north of Kazakhstan. But the crash site is a bit outside Moscow City in Moscow Oblast. At this point, I should say if I get any pronunciations wrong in this video, I apologize in advance. Um, I've decided to do a bit of research tonight in preparation for this video because I want to discuss the issue of aviation safety in Russia. It does seem that barely a year goes by without a major incident, and before I get into that, just a few honest thoughts about these sort of situations. One of the most heartbreaking things is seeing relatives in the airport awaiting news, and they probably know that it's the worst. It's really an awful thing. It's awful for the relatives, of course, but it's also very difficult, I imagine, for airport staff because they're in a sense, the first responders. They're the people who have to deal with this human tragedy. They need to calm, to reassure the relatives. It must be a really, really difficult job. And I really empathize with anyone in that position. My father worked in the port of Rotterdam for some years, and there was a collision on the North Sea very early into his job there. He was support chaplain, which basically meant it was a clerical role, but he dealt with all sorts of the working side of it as well. Anyway, this collision in the North Sea, 10 men drowned. And my dad had the job of speaking to their relatives in the Philippines, but also to speak to relatives to reassure them that their loved ones were okay. I have to say, I was very proud of my father for the work he done there. It was very difficult, and I think he handled it very well. Um, so that's the thing I immediately think of, the people who, first and foremost, have lost their loved ones, but also those who are directly involved in putting out information and dealing with that very, very trying situation. Um, I don't know if I could do it, and have enormous sympathy for people who have that task, but someone has to do it. So I've decided to do a bit of research because this issue of safety in Russian aviation often comes up. I will say that a country as big as Russia is obviously going to have had a history of more accidents than a small country. Russia's the world's biggest country, so you would expect a history of some accidents, but it does seem to have had a lot. There's some other countries that come to mind that seem to have quite a long history of aviation incidents. Iran's had quite a few, um, and I think Colombia's had more than its fair share. I mean, so there are some countries that stand out. To put things in context, the Russian company Aeroflot, that company alone has had no fewer than 8 major incidents, and the research I've been doing has been on Wikipedia pages, of course, have to be sourced. It's not the perfect source, but gives you a kind of indicator of the situation. Um, as I understand it, some of the major Russian airlines have greatly improved their safety record, and they can operate outside Russia. But some of the domestic Russian airlines, of which I believe this company Saratov Airlines was one, are still banned by the EU, and they're still not allowed to operate outside Russia. And there might be good reason for that. But this aviation incident, 71 people have perished. That's pretty major. So what I've done is I've done research on all the major aviation incidents, by which I've looked at those with 20 or more fatalities. That's not including many incidents below that, just as a way to sort of measure this. Now, what I've discovered is that since sort of looking at a time frame, I've only looked at those after the Cold War, so after 1991, although with some major incidents I've taken into consideration before that. Um, there's a lot of ways to look at it. There have been incidents on Russian soil that have involved other airliners, so it wouldn't be fair to perhaps judge Russian aviation for that. Although, of course, each incident has to be investigated. There's complexities around each individual incident. No two air disasters are exactly the same. Um, I'm focusing on Russia as opposed to the world situation, like I say, because Russia does seem to have had a lot. Thinking of the 2010s decade alone, there have been one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight major incidents on Russian soil just in the 2010s alone. This is, of course, the most recent. Christmas Day 2016, there was that awful incident in the Black Sea when the Russian Defense Ministry airline, the Tupolev Tu-154, went down with the loss of 92 lives, um, including an entire choir ensemble. Other tragedies that come to mind, the entire Russian ice hockey team in the 2011 incident at Yaroslavl, 44 perished. Um, there have been some incidents that have involved terrorism or geopolitical situations, and I haven't included them in the rankings of the worst aviation accidents for the obvious reason that they're not accidents. So, for example, the worst actual single incident on Russian soil, i.e., involving loss of life, was a major incident of the Cold War when Korean Airlines 007 was shot down by the Soviet Air Force off Sakhalin Island. The 1st of September 1983, 269 people perished. That caused a real rift, certainly between South Korea and the Soviet Union, also between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was at the height of the Cold War. That's a very infamous incident. The worst actual incident involving a Russian loss of life was, of course, over Sinai several years ago. That still remains a mystery. In all likelihood, it was ISIS that shot that down. Metrojet Flight 9268. I'm not sure if Metrojet is a Russian carrier, but certainly most of the victims were Russian. 224 people perished. So that certainly remains the worst um, aviation incident involving Russian loss of life. Um, some other incidents that come to mind. The worst accident as opposed to terrorist incident or shoot down on Russian soil, Aeroflot Flight 3352, 1984 in the city of Omsk, 178 perished. The second worst, Aeroflot, again, Flight 217, 1972, Sheremetyevo Airport outside Moscow, 174 perished. Um, Now, the third worst incident, 2001, Vladivostok Airlines, Flight 352, 145 people perished. The fourth worst, Irkutsk, January 1994, Baikal Airlines, 125 perished. The fifth, also 125 fatalities, July 2006, was S7 Airlines Flight 778 at Irkutsk. Again, 125 people perished. Um, One of the worst incidents in recent years was very infamous because the Polish president Lech Kaczynski was among the victims. So was his wife and the Polish leader in exile. Um, and that was involving a Tu-154. Most of the victims are Polish. It was considered a Polish national tragedy. 96 people perished, and that was in the city of Smolensk. There's still a lot of conspiracy theories going on around that. It was a major story at the time. So I've looked at basically major incidents after after 1991, and I've come across no fewer than about. Let me just add this up as I'm looking at it right here. If you bear with me a second, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I've come across at least 21 incidents since 1991 involving 20 or more fatalities on Russian soil. Um, 22, in fact. Yeah, September 2008 in the city of Perm, Aeroflot Flight 821, 88 people perished. So there's been a lot of tragedies. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that Russia still remains quite a dangerous country for flying. 21 or 22 major incidents in the modern era. So that by any you know any way of looking at that, that is a lot. Certainly, personally speaking, I would be very reluctant to take a regional airliner in Russia. Now, statistically speaking, you would probably still be safe. You would probably still be unlikely to be in a major incident. But those figures are quite telling. There's been certainly more than in any other country I can think of. Now, you could argue Russia's a bigger country, but if you go by population, then in theory, China should have the most aviation accidents, but that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it's been some time that there's been a major aviation accident on Chinese soil that I can think of, and I look at these things very closely. So you could be forgiven for thinking Russia still has some way to go to improve its aviation record. But I don't want people to think I'm politicizing this. It's not about point scoring. It's not about saying one country's better than others. It's about human lives. It's about this is a critical issue. So I hope if the black box is recovered in this, some lessons can be learned. Apparently, the Saratov company has actually had quite a good safety record up to now. So who knows what's happened? Um, Speaking about the UK, the last major incident on British soil that wasn't involving terrorism that I can think of was the M2 plane crash in 1989. We often get every year we get small aircraft incidents. I'd say at least once or twice a year, which are usually involving just private flights, and that's often involving families or individuals. Usually it's three or four fatalities, but big major incidents. The last one I can think of was the M2 crash in 1989. Lockerbie, of course, was a terrorist attack. Um, the Manchester plane crash of 1985. Um, so those are some that come to mind. Um, so I just hope they can find out what's happened here. And I can't imagine the hell that the relatives are going through. Thinking of the world, aviation in world terms, it has actually improved significantly since the 1970s. If you look at the number of major incidents per year, compared to, say, the mid 70s, you'll see that there is a lot more at that time. There were a lot more deadly incidents at that time. And bearing in mind, far more people are flying today than at that time, then proportionally speaking, it probably is safer than ever before. What happens is when there is a major incident like Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, of course, people ask questions, which is natural. People say, "Oh, is aviation safe?" But when a big disaster like that happens, of course, it's going to get news. But I think if you compare the situation today, let's say the 2010s decade, to the 1970s, definitely I would say it's improved, especially given that far more people are flying. And that's probably down to a range of factors, probably improvement in design, probably countries having stricter rules on which airlines can operate. I think there's a range of factors. If we look at also Yeah, I think overall you would see the situation has improved. It's a bit like if we look at road safety, uh, the overall number of people dying on roads in developed countries has definitely dropped from, say, the between the 1940s and 1960s. Again, because a lot of, even though more people are using the roads, safety designs have greatly improved, among other things. So something to think about. But as just as a closing point, my heart goes out to everyone impacted by this tragedy, um, especially in the conditions. It's, from what I could see, it was completely snow covered. It looks like really awful conditions as well. So it's terrible. But those are some things to think about. It's difficult to see the situation in Russia has improved a great deal. But then again, that list on Wikipedia might be incomplete. I couldn't find any incidents from the 1960s, and I found that hard to believe. So probably the list was incomplete.